To give the context of where this story is based, I live in a smallish college town near a small to medium-sized city. The town itself doesn't have a lot of people, and is mostly here to cater to the demand that comes from the college. Because of this, the stores around the college are mostly open 24/7 so that the college kids will be able to impulse buy whatever they like. The other big seller around here is gas. Of course, gas can be bought in the city, but being a town that is often gone through in order to get to the city, a lot of places will try to keep the price of gas slightly lower than any of the stations in the city. My story begins when I was working overnights at a gas station/liquor store when I was doing part-time classes in college, but mostly doing classes online so that they wouldn't run my availability for a full-time job. The store that I worked at had only one person working on overnights for a long time. Even though a lot of people, especially girls, would complain of the lack of cameras and the fact that you don't always get the best people going into the liquor store and gas station in the middle of the night. The owner's hand was forced on one night, before I started working there, that a woman who came in to buy milk went outside to her car, only for a man to come up behind her and then shove a gun up to her back, then demanding her for money. She complied with him, and luckily, he let her go. She ran into the store sobbing hysterically, and though the police arrived shortly after, he was never found. I personally preferred to having two people on with me, even if there wasn't a safety issue. The night seemed to go by so much quicker when someone else was there, and it was really nice that the person I normally close with got along with me so well. Overall, there were 4 overnight shift workers: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and myself. Dixie had another job and was really only working there as a favor to one of the managers, so she would really only work about 2 nights a week with either Josh or I. Josh and I worked together about 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh or I about 2 nights a week. Dixie was really nice and fun to be around, but she didn't really particularly like the job or really want to be there. Josh would get annoyed with her a lot for just standing behind the register while he did all the work, but it was only 1 night a week, so he didn't really complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was a little bit different. He worked there 5 days a week, just like Josh and I, but they never seemed to put him with more than one person 1 day a week. Nobody seemed to really like him or like working with him. Nick was also a little off from the start. He was one of those people who basically told you his entire life story as soon as he met you, giving a bunch of really personal details that no one was really comfortable with hearing. One thing that he always seemed to talk about was the strain that was on his marriage. Apparently, he had a really bad drinking and drug problem for a very long time, and the drug part got better when he could switch over to weed, but he couldn't seem to get his drinking under control. He was hard to be around, but you kind of get used to the people in that kind of job being sketchy. I was there for almost 3 months when Nick's story seemed to escalate out of nowhere. He began telling people that when he was younger, he was diagnosed as a psychopath, and he had to take a bunch of pills for it every day so he wouldn't be violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night, but okay. We all have our problems, and some people get dealt a really bad hand when it comes to mental illness. I myself have always really struggled to get my anxiety and depression under control, and without medicine, I mean, I wouldn't be killing people by any means, but I'd probably be hospitalized in danger to self categories, so as creepy as that was, I just assured them that a lot of people need to take medicine for some kind of illness, and as long as you stick with it and you're honest with medical professionals, there's no reason you can't still do anything anyone else can do. He seemed really pleased with this answer, and soon after, the subject was then turned to other things. He was especially cheery and nice to me after that for about the next week or so, letting me know daily that he was taking his medicine and he felt like things were really going well with them. I always answered enthusiastically, but I'm pretty sure everyone, especially Josh, was aware of how much I wished that he would just stop talking to me about it and would really just leave me alone. Josh had a wife and daughter who was about 2 at the time, so he couldn't help but to see us younger girls as kind of like his daughter and what she might have to deal with one day. He also seemed to go out of his way to end my conversations with Nick rather quickly, which I was really grateful for, and he didn't really try to pretend that he liked Nick. It wasn't too long before Nick had started conversations with me going into details about why I was diagnosed instead of how his medicine was working, which I won't get into because a lot of it was very violent and sexual. I told him repeatedly that I really didn't want to know about that, to which he would act like he understood and then change the subject, only for him to circle back to it about an hour later. When I confided in Dixie about it, she told me that she would take care of it. She later told her friend about it, which was the same manager who asked her to come work there. The manager said she couldn't really do much, since I seemed to be the only one that he would talk to about these things. It was starting to get increasingly tense for everyone working with him after he was talked to by the manager, and soon enough, about 2 other women who had worked with him on the night shift reported comments that he made to them to the manager. I was questioned, in which I agreed that all of the statements made by the women were pretty similar to the things that had been said to me. Nick was then given a final warning and a write-up. The next couple of times I saw him, he would go on these rants about how the people that were reporting him only did it because they didn't like him. I assumed that he didn't know that I had been questioned too, and neither I or Josh had any intention to tell him. He got so angry at one point that he was practically in tears, saying how those lucky whores were really lucky that he was on his meds and what he would do to them if he wasn't. Luckily, it was about that point that his shift had ended, and pretty much as soon as he clocked out, Josh then told him that we had a lot of work to get done that night, so we really didn't have time to chat with him. He nodded and walked out the door without another word. Josh wasn't lying either. The truck had arrived extremely late that day, so there was still quite a bit of things that still needed to be put on the shelf. One thing that the earlier shifts never seemed to do unless they absolutely had to was stocking the drink coolers. It was true that it was easier to do at night when there was a lot less customers, so it was pretty annoying since we couldn't chat, but we just went with it. I can't really remember the time that Josh had went into the drink cooler, but it must have been pretty late since we had been there for a while at that point. I was still pretty focused on stocking all of the shelves and making sure everything looked full if we didn't have it, when the bell had chimed, signaling that someone had come into the store. I threw out a good evening and said that I'd be right there, since anyone that usually came in that late usually just wanted a pack of cigarettes or to pay for gas. I put down my box and went to the registers, slowing dramatically once I could see them. You guessed it. There was Nick, not looking at me but leaning over to my register. I'd be lying if I said I had a reason to be afraid. It did turn out he was drunk, but I wasn't able to detect it right away, as the smell of booze always seemed to linger in the air around there anyways. And Josh was right on the other side of the wall. Even so, I actually considered for about 30 seconds if I should actually go or if I should run into the cooler and go get Josh. Nick wasn't a young fit guy or anything, but years of drugs and drinking had really aged him prematurely and totally ruined his body. But I mean, he was still pretty intimidating to a 20-year-old girl. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me when, probably tired of waiting, turned right toward me, and that's when I noticed something immediately was off about him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted. He just stared at me. There was nothing on his face to tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he then spoke, barely intelligible because of his slurring.
Did he leave you alone?
It took me a second to shake my head and tell him in a hopefully steady voice that Josh was in the cooler, and then I asked if he wanted me to go get him. And once again, he was just staring at me in silence. At this point, I didn't even care what he said. I just wanted him to say something. The silent staring was really creeping me out. I then decided to ask with more force in my voice. "What do you want, Nick?" As soon as I stopped speaking, he then grinned at me in a really disgusting, almost singing voice. Then he said,
"You're lying. I know you're alone."
He laughed and then he took a step toward me but stumbled, allowing me to take several steps backwards. At this point, I should have just run to Josh. I should have called for him, really anything, but I really couldn't believe that I was reading the situation right. I mean, Nick was really weird, but I had never felt like I was in actual danger around him. He had never come off as more than a little unstable. He continued to come forward in slow stumbling steps, then saying,
"Come here, I just want to talk."
I kept out of his reach, telling him to back off and that I would hurt him if I had to. He thought that was specifically amusing, and he laughed loudly enough that Josh had told me later was what caused him to look through the spaces of the racks to see what was going on. Josh was out the door in a second, and he seemed to come out of nowhere, then shoving himself in between Nick and I. They didn't even say anything. They just stared each other down before Josh then said in a really stern tone, "I think you should leave now." Nick just blankly stared for a moment, then scoffed, then telling us that we couldn't take a joke. I was trying not to cry at this point. The only thing more terrifying about the situation was knowing that if Josh hadn't been there and had somehow caught me, I would have stood no chance against Nick. Josh left me standing with my back against the wall, corraling Nick to the door. Completely unexpected on both of our parts, Nick then turned and then took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because he was drunk or really uncoordinated, he missed Josh's face, and Josh then grabbed the back of his coat and then brought him down as he then smashed his knee into Nick's stomach or chest area. I'm not really sure which, but he used the opportunity of his sputtering to drag him to the door and then throw him out, now locking it. Josh had just turned and he told me to call the cops as we then heard this sickening crack from behind him. We both jumped and looked at the door to then find this really big circle of glass. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever seen a movie or one of an actual car wreck when something hits a windshield, but not hard enough to break through, and it turns white all around the point of impact, that's what the door looked like. Josh didn't have to tell me what to do. This time I ran to the register, grabbed my phone, going to the corner farthest away from the front door, and then huddled on the floor. I didn't even notice at the time, but Josh had told me later that when he turned to see the glass, that was the first time that he noticed that Nick had a knife in his other hand. The fact that he tried to punch Josh instead of stab him is a mystery and a miracle. I was absolutely sobbing when the operator picked up the phone. I don't even know how she understood me. I was crying so loud. But between my distress and the sounds of Josh and Nick yelling at each other in the background with loud smashes of Nick hitting the floor, she got the urgency of the situation. She asked me where I was, and luckily she knew the address because just as I got up to look at a receipt to what the address was, the glass smashed. I dropped back to the floor and she told me that the officers were already on the way and to do whatever I could to get away or even hide, even if that meant that I had to leave Josh. The hole wasn't big enough for him to get through, but he made it by grabbing the ashtray from outside and then throwing it at the part of the window that he had been repeatedly punching, causing it to break through. He didn't make it to break through though. From that hole, he could reach the lock on the door, then get back inside. According to Josh, he had walked up to the door and then he put his mouth against the hole that he had just formed, and then said something that even right now I still sob over. In that horrible sing-song voice that he used the first time I talked to him that night. He then said in such a happy tone,
"They're never going to find you two."
Needless to say, as tough as he was acting, Josh was shitting bricks just as much as I was. He was older than Nick, in his mid-30s, but he was a beanpole, and he wasn't exactly known for his fighting skills. Even so, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh then slammed his entire body into it, knocking Nick backwards from the impact. Josh then yelled for me to run, and even though my legs felt like they would give out at any moment, I ran right behind him to the receiving doors that were in the back of the store. Nick was cursing and yelling for us as the door jingle went off. Josh slammed into the back door, cursing in pain, as he then realized that it wouldn't open. We found out later that Nick had pushed the dumpster in front of the door, locking the wheels of it again before he came in. We seemed to both realize at once that he had actually planned this all out to kill us. Nick rounded the corner, still doing that awkward stumbling walk, though faster now. It at least gave me some time to slam the back room door shut and then lock it. I was sitting in front of it, Josh bringing over anything he could find to barricade the door shut, when Nick then finally reached it. He must have heard me crying because he kept calling my name, telling me that I wasn't who he wanted. He would make sure that I died before I felt any kind of pain if I opened the door for him. He then started stabbing the door, then screaming at me to open it. I screamed, and then I moved when he stabbed it the first time, but Josh and I both then moved immediately to hold it shut again. I remember Josh and I making eye contact. We were both crying by now, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him, but I just couldn't think of anything to say. I was just as terrified myself. I had dropped my phone when I ran to hold the door shut, and neither of us could move to go get it. So we really had no idea how long it would be until the police got there, and the door was made of wood, so it wouldn't really last long against his body slams. And there was absolutely no protection if his knife went into one of our hands. All I could think about was that I was going to die here tonight, that my dog would never know why I didn't come home, that I would never get my degree and have enough money to actually start enjoying life, that all of the plans for the future that my girlfriend and I had made would never happen. In the most anticlimactic and wonderful finish ever, it suddenly went silent. There was no police car alarms, no yelling, nothing. It was as if Nick had just vanished. Josh and I looked at each other, not even daring to breathe, then listening for any sign of life on the other side of the door. We both slammed to the ground when we heard a gunshot then go off once, then twice, then a third time. There was more silence, then at last a voice rang out, then asking if anyone was here. We weren't really sure if we should say anything. Then the voice continued with his name and that he was an off-duty EMT who had been listening to the scanner. Josh got up and pushed all of the things aside in front of the door, opening it enough just to put his head out of it, and then it seemed like all of the breath just totally left him. He opened the door and went out into the store. I ran and grabbed my phone, seeing that the call had disconnected or the dispatcher had hung up. When I went out into the store where Josh and our rescuer was, he was in the middle of explaining how the police over the scanner were sending a bunch of cars, but that they were all pretty far away and he had a really horrible feeling that they wouldn't get there in time when the dispatcher was telling them what they'd find when they got there. He didn't want either of us to go outside until the police got there because though Nick had been shot in the shoulder, he still had the knife when he took off. The EMT said that he would have run after him, but with the state that the store was in, he was really scared that someone in the store could be dying or hurt. The next 20 minutes were a total blur. Josh and I were just sitting on the floor hugging each other when the police finally arrived. The EMT had called dispatch and he told them of the new situation, and most of the cars that were coming to our location were then diverted to looking for Nick. It was soon after that Josh got to use his phone to call his wife, and she came right over, only bringing their daughter because he begged her to. He seemed to completely break down when he held his daughter and hugged his wife. I had an extremely similar reaction when I finally got to go home and came in to see my dog's wiggling body as he was so excited to see me. Nick was found about 2 weeks later in an old RV that he had in the woods. The reason that he had come after us was because he thought that the reason Josh wanted him to leave so quickly was so that he could call the owner again, and this time the complaint would get him fired. Unknown to us, his wife had actually kicked him out about 4 days before this all happened, and she was actually in the process of getting a restraining order against him, due to a bunch of threatening texts and phone calls that she had been getting. Nick stated to the police that his job was all that he had left, and Josh needed to be punished for trying to take that away from him. He said that I wasn't the target and he really didn't want to have to kill me, but he knew that he had a much better chance of killing Josh with me there than Dixie, since Josh would be more likely to face him to protect me. Neither Josh or I called an owner or even a manager over his comments that night, though maybe we should have. It was really disturbing what he was saying in hindsight, but we were so used to him being a creep and saying really horrible things that it didn't even register to us that he could be serious about trying to hurt someone. I had known him for 3 months and Josh had known him for 6, and he had never done anything violent toward anyone. Everyone just thought he was all talk. We also put faith in the fact that every employee had a background check on them before they were hired. So I mean, it's not like Nick had ever been violent before. Nick took a plea deal. He did this so that the 2 counts of attempted murder would be dropped, and instead would go to a mental hospital for offenders. The reason that I'm writing this story now is that I got a phone call about 2 weeks ago. It was basically notifying me that as long as there's no setbacks to his health, Nick is actually set to be released on June 8th of this year. When I called Josh, he said that he had received the same news the day before. Neither Josh or I work there anymore, and Josh has since moved away to another town on the other side of the city. I've switched to going to college completely online, and I'm in a new place that I'm renting with a roommate. I really don't think that he'll ever come after either of us. I don't see how he could blame us for what happened. I read so many of these stories, and after the fact, everyone always seems so prepared for what to do if they ever see the person they're writing about again. I really don't think that I'd be any more prepared to face him this time than I was back then. I've had some pretty intense nightmares ever since that day, but ever since I got that call, every time I close my eyes, all I can hear is that one sentence louder and clearer than I've ever heard it since it was actually said.
They're never going to find you two.
Nick, if it's really true that you were diagnosed as a psychopath, I hope you're getting the help you need. You already destroyed my peace of mind, and even now, years later, I never feel safe, especially at night. I'm honestly going to do my best to move on from this, but I just don't know how. Wish me luck. I've never really told this story, at least not completely, but it's something that I still think about from time to time. It kind of haunts me. I used to work as a manager of a fast food place in a rather seedy part of a medium-sized city. I'd worked at the nicer location until they decided to transfer me, and there were actually rumors that the location I ended up being sent to was going to be shut down, which did end up happening a few years after I left. Anyway, the point is that the place wasn't being well taken care of. The dining room was really dated and old, and the owners were certainly not updating or maintaining the place well. They were just barely maintaining the very basic safety requirements, and sometimes they weren't even doing that. For example, I often worked the closing shift, which for this location at the time was 4 p.m. to midnight. Between 7 p.m. and 11 p.m., it was running the drive-thru and the front counter all by myself, and then one employee running the kitchen. At 11 p.m., that other employee would go home, and I was left by myself to tidy up and then do the deposit around 11 p.m. to 12 p.m. This isn't really safe, and I'm really not even sure if it was entirely legal at the time. This was over a decade ago though, so who really knows? Just to provide a little context and background here, I'm a girl, but I'm not what you would consider small. I'm about 6 foot, and during this time, I think people would probably say that I came across as a little more than stern. I was younger, but I'd already spent years working in fast food, constantly getting treated like crap by customers, as well as having drinks and food thrown at me. The location that I worked at was absolutely riddled with junkies and drug dealers, and just general really scary behavior. All this to say, I didn't really get ruffled that easily, and I took a lot of things in stride. However, on this night, I was working the night shift with a new guy. The new guy had probably been working there for no more than a few weeks. I'd worked with him a few times before, but never the closing shift, and from the first time I'd met him, I'd always got this really strange vibe from him. And again, I'm not someone who got ruffled up easily. Prior to this, I'd actually worked with a night janitor at the other location, who'd had an Adderall addiction and a rather unpredictable and scary rage problem, and some creepy incel kid who barely spoke more than 2 words at a time. And when he did, it was always something about how much he disliked women, and me in particular. And I'm not exaggerating. But this guy, this new dude, he was a whole different level of weird. He had a kid and he professed to be a single father. He would bring the kid around work during the day, and the kid and his clothing were always really dirty. Like really dirty. And not only that, but the kid also occasionally had bruises on his head and arms. The kid was a toddler, and I know that toddlers can get into things, but one look at that kid and I just knew that those bruises were not something from a little kid just messing around. Now, I never saw the new guy behave aggressively toward his kid like at all, but I don't know. It was just a feeling. And that feeling translated into other things. I don't know. He was just really creepy. It wasn't one thing in particular. It was just a feeling I got whenever I was around him. He was a medium-height, stocky young guy. He was totally average in every way, but he just had this really weird vibe about him. He was always really friendly, never rude or aggressive, but his eyes were just lifeless, for a lack of a better description. Anyway, on this night in particular, I think that he might have been called in to cover a shift for someone else. Most of the time, I was in charge of making the schedules, so I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't have scheduled him to work with me since I found him so off-putting. The first part of the night was fairly normal. I ran the drive-thru in the front counter and he ran the kitchen between 8 to 11 p.m. He was talking to me on and off between orders, telling me about his ex and how he'd become a single father. Apparently, the mother of his child had a drug problem. In hindsight, I think a lot of what he said was meant to inspire sympathy. He really laid the troubled tale of him and his son on thick, but at the time, I just felt a little bad for both of them, especially his kid, who I suspected was being abused. But despite being seen as stern, I was definitely still young and naive whenever it came to manipulative people. He told me that he moved to the city and pretty much immediately had trouble finding work, prior to getting the job at the place we worked at. He said that he'd been running out of money and was really behind on rent, bills, and didn't have any formula for a son. At the time, I think I just empathized with him and I told him that it sucked. I mean, we were both working in fast food, so I thought it was pretty obvious that neither of us had any money. The place was bare bones minimum wage, and I was barely getting by with 3 roommates, and I was pretty much only eating the free meal that I was given a day from the restaurant. Anyway, he laid it on thick pretty much all night long, but I really don't know that I was really paying all that much attention to it. People tended to ramble whenever working the late shift, and I'd gotten pretty used to listening to people spontaneously talk about their personal problems. I kind of had a habit of just listening and not really reciprocating the sharing, and I guess this didn't really go over very well with the new guy. At some point, the new guy then said something to the effect of,
You don't talk much, do you? I'm telling you my whole life story here and you've got nothing to say?
Now, I don't know if it was just that I was coming across as unsympathetic, or more likely that he was really just frustrated that he wasn't manipulating me into giving up personal details about my life. As far as I was concerned, he was just someone I worked with, and I didn't know him. I didn't really want him to know me, and I certainly wasn't about to tell him anything that wasn't surface-level chit-chat. But the guy was really intimidating. Something about his tone was just really off. It definitely wasn't a jokey accusation or off-the-cuff comment. I can't really remember exactly what I said, but I remember that I just tried to play it off somehow. He didn't really say anything else about it, but after that happened, the silence between us seemed a little tense. At 11 p.m., it was time for him to go home. The normal procedure was the person closing the kitchen would tidy up their area, and then an actual kitchen cleaner would come back in a couple hours later to deep clean things. In our case, it was a husband and wife team who did several locations, but they didn't usually come in until a few hours after I left. So this guy was only tasked with basic tidy, and then I would let him out, after which I would stay behind to prepare the deposit. But instead of this happening smoothly, this guy then goes into the staff bathroom and stays there. And I mean for a really long time, like almost 20 minutes or something. I didn't know what was going on, nor did I know exactly how to handle it. It had honestly never happened before. People could usually not get out of there fast enough at the end of the night. Was he sick? Did he fall asleep? I didn't know, but I really just wanted to get my work done and go home. He finally emerged and then quickly walked to the door and left. I was relieved. It was weird, but I just shrugged it off and hurried back to the office to get done what I needed to get done. Not 10 minutes later, I start to hear a really loud banging at the back door of the restaurant, repeatedly. Now, normally I would just ignore this. The back door faced an alley and it was right next to a street full of bars and pubs. People leaving bars and pubs often got the idea that banging on the door would get them after-hours fast food service because, well, they were drunk. So this wasn't necessarily uncommon. So I decided to just ignore it and keep hurrying to get things done. But I kid you not, the banging didn't stop. It somehow just seemed to get louder and louder and more urgent. So I finally got up and went to look out the peephole to see who was there. At this point, I was definitely on edge. And this edginess swelled into a full-out anxiety attack when I see that it's the new guy standing at the back door. My first thought was not to open the door. I really didn't want to open the door, but I knew that he knew that I was in there. What if he forgot something inside? What if it was his house keys, car keys, or something important? I was going to have to leave the building by that same door at some point, so there really seemed to be no escaping him. So reluctantly, I opened the door. What I opened the door to was, quite frankly, absolutely terrifying to me. He said that he left his jacket inside the store, and I told him to tell me where and I'd go get it. I just really didn't want him to come inside. Now, if this had been any other person that I worked with normally, this wouldn't be a big deal. I'd let them back in, let them get whatever they left behind, and they'd take off. But I instinctively knew that I didn't want this dude back inside in the dark, empty restaurant all alone with me. But the new dude was totally not having it. He pushed past me and said he'd get it himself. Then he proceeded to shut himself in the bathroom again. And at this point, I just panicked. Instead of just staying there by the door, which in hindsight I probably should have done, I rushed back to the office. I know I'm stupid. Stupid girl, which is me, had left some of the cash that I was counting for the deposit out. What dummy would answer the back door at night at all? And especially with a till out? Well, I guess my dumbass. I managed to stuff the cash in the safe and then lock it before he came to find me. The office was dark. It was summer and the air conditioning was on full blast, but this dude was sweating a crap ton. I was taller than him and I'm not a small girl, but somehow I just knew that this guy was about to hurt me. He was keyed up. As I watched his eyes dart around the office, I then grabbed my jacket, which was hanging on the hook next to me. I hadn't finished my deposit, but I didn't care. I was gonna get out of there. I didn't care how much crap I got into in the morning for my work not being done. I smiled and told him that I was just leaving and that he could walk me out. I was really just trying my best not to show my panic. Whatever he had planned, I wanted to give him an out for him to rethink. So I smiled, grabbed my purse, and started to move towards the door. New guy who was standing in the doorway did not budge though. He started talking though about his son, about the money trouble he'd been having, and then capped the whole story off with a request for a loan. Now, from the tone of his voice, it was clear this was not a loan. He was demanding money from me. He said that he would pay me back as soon as he got paid and that I'd really be helping him out. I really didn't know what to do. He had me trapped. I wasn't leaving the office or the building unless he allowed it, or at this point at least, I wasn't leaving without a fight. Something told me that despite my height difference, I wasn't going to win, so I decided to give him some money from my wallet. It was around $50, I think. When I gave it to him, he then said,
"Thanks. You're really helping me and my son. I won't forget it."
But when he said it, he had no expression. No smile and no speech effect at all. He didn't seem grateful or even relieved, just dead eyes and limp arms at his sides. It was terrifying. To this day, I don't really remember how I got him to the door. All I remember was shutting the door behind him, making sure the door was securely locked, and then rushing into the office to burst into tears. I didn't finish my work, but I stayed there until I could force myself to leave out of that same door. I was pretty sure he was going to jump me when I left. The thought never occurred to me to call the cops. I don't know why. I guess I just felt like nothing serious had happened yet. He'd asked me for money and I'd willingly given it to him, despite the fact that I felt I had no choice and had been scared shitless the entire night. I only saw him one more time after that, but neither of us ever mentioned that night or the money. I really don't know why I didn't ask for it back. I think I was embarrassed or scared, or both. I don't know. I don't think I've ever told anyone in my life this story. Or at least if I have, I definitely left out the part where I gave him the money and never got it back. Not too long after that, he stopped showing up to his shifts, and I never saw him again. I don't believe in throwing words like psychopath around. I really feel like people overuse psychological terms like that, making them just synonymous with anyone who's horribly behaved. And unfortunately, there's a lot of varying degrees of terribly behaved people in this world. But after taking a lot of abnormal psych classes, I can say that there was definitely something about this guy's effect that was just wrong. I'd smile, he'd smile. I'd frown, he'd frown. It was almost like talking to someone pantomiming emotions. Maybe I'm just remembering it that way because it was such a terrifying experience for me. But the truth is that I've never been comfortable talking about this event. And to this day, whenever I think about it, I feel just as uncomfortable as the day it all happened. I never want to experience anything like that again. So it was around June 2019. I was doing a closing shift at the McDonald's I work at in town. We close up at 2 a.m. on the weekdays and 3 a.m. on the weekend. It had been a Saturday night shift, so I was finished and out of the building by about 3:15 a.m. roughly. When this happened, I was living about a 10 to 15 minute walk from my work in a flat that was mostly taken up by students. I didn't really have any money to spare to constantly get taxis, and I'd been walking home at night for the past year with really no incidents, so of course I didn't really think anything would happen. The majority of the walk was fine, and I was about 4 minutes away from the flat when I noticed a guy just standing around near the corner that I'd turned to get home. I'm really wary when I see other people, but usually they're just drunk and they mind their own business and just ask for directions, or it's a homeless person, as there's quite a lot in the city I live in. But at that time of night, like I said before, they usually just keep to themselves. This guy was dressed pretty nice but casual, looked around mid-20s, well-groomed, tan skin, and this really strong smelling aftershave. He obviously was a regular at the gym too, because he had a really muscular figure, and he didn't seem to be too drunk by the looks of things. But I mean, who knows? I really tried to keep my distance, but he then approached me and started making really casual conversation, asking me what my name was, complimenting my accent, and asking me where I'm from. I stupidly engaged with him but gave him a fake name and then made it clear that I wasn't up for a chat. I should have been firm with my words, but I'm way too introverted and shy to speak up. Even my own boyfriend complains that I talk too quietly sometimes, and I really struggle to be direct with people. Throughout the whole conversation, he was always giving me this really unsettling smile, and he would try and touch my arm or play with my hair, which I made as clear as I possibly could that I didn't approve of it. Not that he was even listening. He would just say something along the lines of,
"But you're just so pretty."
Not flattering at all when it's a man who won't take no for an answer. Anyways, this guy asked me for a hug, and even though I refused him as politely as possible, he did it anyways. I froze up for a couple of seconds before I moved away, which thankfully he let me do. He was being extremely creepy at this point and tried feeling over at my sides as he hugged me, which gave me even more red flags. I told him I had to leave, and as I was walking away, I then heard,
"I'll walk you home. Where do you live?"
Unfortunately, I really had nowhere else to go but home. Nobody else was around and it was way too early in the morning. My roommate was also back at his own house as he went back home every weekend. I had a hold of my keys in my pocket and just hoped that once I got into the building, I could hopefully find a way in without this guy being able to invite himself in. I refused the walk home, but he followed me anyways, walking about 8 to 10 feet away from me as I was speeding up at this point, but then caught up as I crossed the road. I really don't know why, but I decided to go the long way to get to my building, and as I was approaching the flat, I felt this horrible sinking feeling deep in my chest. The door to the building closes really slow at first before slamming shut, so I knew even when I walked in he could potentially follow me inside, and that puts me at an even greater risk. By this point, he was pretty much begging me to let him inside. He said that he was extremely thirsty and he wanted some water, but I told him that my roommate is sleeping. A subtle way to try and deter him by showing him I wasn't alone, but that didn't seem to faze him. He was trying to be touchy and he just kept pleading with me to be let inside, but I kept my ground. I kept telling him no as best as possible. As he was talking to me, I managed to use my fob on the door and only opened it enough to carefully slide through. However, he was right at the door and I didn't want to make him upset, so I then apologized and I told him no once again. Luckily, he had to move away from the door as someone wanted to get into the building. The guy that was entering the flat then asked me if everything was okay when he saw me, but really stupidly, I said everything was fine. That did give me a chance though to move away from the door, and I let it close once the guy walked through. I didn't even look back to the guy once. I just ran up the stairs to my flat as fast as I could. I didn't get any sleep that night, and from that moment on, I made sure to always have money aside for a taxi. I think I walked home maybe once more between June to October, right before I moved. Really scary stuff, and I'm really glad that I never saw him ever again after that.